All right, let's dive right into this explainer. If you are hunting for that perfect exam blueprint for the AQA A-level psychology topic on dealing with offending behavior, well, you've officially found it. Today, we are putting anger management squarely under the microscope.
So here's our game plan. We're going to map this explainer out using the AQA assessment objectives, AO1, AO2, and AO3, plus a solid grave analysis. By the end of this, you're going to know exactly how to structure your exam answers to hit those top bands. Let's get right to it. Section 1, AO1, Understanding Anger Management, the Theoretical Foundations. Let's start by securing those AO1 marks, just looking at what anger management actually is and the psychological theory driving it. The absolutely crucial point to establish right out of the gate is the incredible depth of this approach. Unlike basic behavior modification techniques, like token economies that just look at surface-level behavior, this is a deep, rehabilitative intervention. We're talking about a cognitive behavioral treatment targeting real, internal cognitive change. It relies heavily on Raymond Novako's foundational work from back in the 1970s. Getting that context into your opening paragraph, that shows the examiners you truly understand the psychological roots of the therapy. Now, Novako conceptualized anger not just as some random, unpredictable outburst, but actually as a pretty rigid three-part structure. First up, you have a cognitive trigger. That trigger leads to physical arousal. And finally, that physical arousal just boils over into a behavioral expression. Because of this really structured view of anger, effective programs, like the widely used CALM program in UK prisons, use this specific three-stage process to intervene at literally every single level of that structure. This step-by-step, manualized nature of the therapy is exactly what makes it so robust. Stage 1 is cognitive preparation. This is where offenders sit down with a therapist to identify their specific triggers and really critically analyze those irrational thought patterns. Stage 2 is skills acquisition. Here, they're armed with alternative strategies. They learn things like cognitive restructuring, physical relaxation techniques, and assertive rather than aggressive communication. And finally, stage 3 is application practice. In this absolutely critical phase, they role-play high-risk scenarios with staff to deliberately induce and then safely manage mild physiological arousal. It's basically a journey, right? Moving an offender from baseline self-awareness to building coping strategies and finally testing them out in real-world simulations. Moving on to Section 2. AO2, Application and Connections. Grab in the synoptic marks. We all know the difference between a good answer and a great answer is application, right? What's really fascinating here is how we can connect anger management to entirely different areas of your psychology syllabus. And let me tell you, examiners absolutely love it when you point out these cross-topic links to grab those synoptic marks. For instance, you can link the cognitive preparation stage directly to the cognitive approach, specifically pointing out how it tackles the hostile attribution bias, where offenders misinterpret ambiguous social cues as threatening. On the flip side, the skills acquisition stage directly targets the excessive sympathetic nervous system arousal found in biopsychology's fight-or-flight response. Tying these topics together like that demonstrates a master-level understanding. So let's look at how this all applies to a real-world hypothetical case study to really lock in those high-value AO2 application marks. Meet Liam. He's 35, given a community sentence for domestic violence. His rapid escalation of anger often masked way deeper insecurities. For Liam, misinterpreting simple sarcasm as a direct personal attack was basically the spark that always lit the fuse. Following Liam's journey through Novako's 3 stages, we can see exactly how he builds up that emotional regulation. In cognitive prep, he works with a therapist and finally realizes he's been interpreting entirely ambiguous comments as severe personal attacks. During skills acquisition, he learns to call verbal timeouts and uses grounding techniques to actually lower his heart rate. Then, in application practice, he role-plays common relationship conflicts with his therapist, like money disputes, practicing those exact skills while feeling mildly stressed. But hey, notice the limitation at the bottom of the list there. This intensive process reveals unresolved childhood trauma. This is a vital point for your essays. Anger management might address surface triggers beautifully, but it won't necessarily fix underlying psychological difficulties without broader, much more intensive therapeutic support. Section 3. Key Studies and Grave Analysis. Thinking like an examiner. To firmly anchor your knowledge, we've got to evaluate the supporting evidence using the GRAVE framework. The absolute pivotal study here is Ireland from 2004. Ireland evaluated an anger management program using a quasi-experimental design. They looked at 50 male young offenders in a UK young offender institution, comparing participants in a structured anger management course against a control group that, and this is crucial, received absolutely no intervention at all. Now, the outcomes here are just striking. There was a massive 92% improvement rate on at least one anger measure for the intervention group. That is highly significant and provides massive support for the efficacy of the program. But to show true critical thinking in your exam, you absolutely must point out the flip side. 8% actually deteriorated. Their anger got worse. Pointing this out clearly shows the examiners that you understand anger management is definitely not a magical universal fix for everyone. When we apply the GRAVE framework to this, generalization is an immediate issue. It's pretty low. The sample is only 50 young males in a single young offender institution, meaning we simply cannot confidently generalize these fantastic results to older offenders or to female offenders. But what about reliability? Well, it's actually high. Ireland used triangulated data, meaning they pulled from multiple sources: self-report questionnaires, officer ratings, and official incident records. However, when we look at validity, you have got to point out the risk of social desirability bias in the self-report data. Offenders might simply lie to look good for the parole board, right? That artificially inflates the success rate and lowers internal validity. Walking through this framework systematically like this will absolutely set you apart. Final section, AO3 Evaluating the Approach, Strengths and Limitations. Let's wrap this all up by diving into the critical evaluation of anger management as a rehabilitative tool. The strengths of this approach are really substantial. First off, it directly targets internal causes, like cognitive distortions and physiological arousal, which provides broad, long-lasting psychological benefits. It's also firmly supported by highly evidence-based cognitive behavioral therapy principles. And crucially, from an institutional standpoint, studies consistently prove it reduces institutional aggression, making prisons significantly safer for both the staff and the inmates themselves. Bottom line, it is incredibly effective for offenders whose crimes stem from reactive, impulsive aggression.
However, the limitations are severe, and you must discuss these for those top band AO3 marks. It is largely ineffective for instrumental or premeditated offending. Think fraud, burglary, or calculated gang violence, where spontaneous anger just isn't the primary motivator. It also requires a massive amount of insight, motivation, and verbal skills to even engage in the therapy. That makes it very difficult, if not totally impossible, for offenders with psychopathy or severe personality disorders to participate effectively. And finally, there's surprisingly weak evidence for long-term real-world transfer. When an offender leaves the carefully controlled, totally safe role-play environment of a prison and returns to a chaotic, real-world environment full of peer pressure, financial stress, and maybe drugs, well, those newly learned coping skills often completely break down. When you're evaluating this, a great technique is to contrast it directly with behavior modification, like token economies. Token economies only aim for surface-level behavioral change. You're rewarding an inmate for making their bed or following rules without ever asking why they break the rules in the first place. Anger management is far more psychologically sophisticated because it targets the deep internal mechanisms that are actually driving the destructive behavior. I am going to leave you with this final provocative question to guide your synthesis paragraph. Is anger management a universal fix or just one piece of a multi-component rehabilitation puzzle? Offending is multifactorial, right? It's driven by complex biology, rigid cognition, and incredibly chaotic environments. So shouldn't our rehabilitative systems be exactly as complex? Keep that complexity in mind as you structure your essays. Thanks so much for joining this explainer, and good luck with those exams.